When you admire something beautiful that has survived across time, do you consider who is still paying, right now, today, to keep it alive for you to see? December 1895. Snow falls through the darkness of the North Carolina mountains, not the gentle flurries of postcard winters, but the deep, insistent snow of a southern Appalachian cold snap, the kind that settles into valleys and refuses to leave. Along a winding approach road, carriages move slowly, their lanterns throwing pale circles against the white. Horses exhale clouds of frozen breath, wheels creak against ice. Inside the carriages, America's wealthiest families sit wrapped in furs and silence, traveling deeper into a forest that seems to have no end. For miles, there's been nothing. Only trees. Only the sound of hooves on packed earth. Only the strange sensation of traveling backward through time, away from cities and telephones and the clatter of modern life, into something older and darker and vaster than any of them expected. Then, the forest opens. And there it is, rising from the winter hillside like a fever dream, made stone, lit from within by more electric lights than some of these guests have ever seen concentrated in one place. 250 rooms of French Renaissance architecture transplanted into the wilderness of the American South. 4 acres of floor space, a roofline so complex it contains more than 100 chimneys, towers and spires and gargoyles catch in the falling snow. A house so large that the mind refuses, at first, to accept it as a house at all. It looks instead like a small city, or a great museum, or a castle lifted whole from the Loire Valley and set down in the Blue Mountains of Carolina. The guests step down from their carriages onto a snow-dusted forecourt. Servants in formal dress appear to take their coats, their trunks, their horses. The great front doors swing open. Heat pours out, light pours out, the scent of roasting meat and fresh flowers and burning oak. And for a moment, in that transition from cold to warmth, from darkness to brilliance, from forest silence to the murmur of orchestral music somewhere deep within those glowing halls, for a moment, it seems like magic. But magic has a source. Every spell has a price. Beneath the feet of those arriving guests, running through the foundations of this impossible house, lies a labyrinth of boiler rooms and coal storage, and electrical generators, and servants' passages, and industrial-scale kitchens. Behind every lit window stands someone whose job it is to trim the wick, or feed the furnace, or scrub the floor, or prepare the meal, or carry the water, or wash the linens that will touch the skin of people who will never learn their names. And somewhere in the account books of this estate, books that take up entire shelves, books maintained by secretaries and managers and financial advisors, there are columns of numbers that would give these arriving guests pause. Numbers that represent not just the cost of building this dream, but the cost of waking up inside it every single day. This is Biltmore, and the question it poses is older than the mansion itself. Who truly pays for beauty like this? Not just then, not just once, but now and tomorrow, and every day into a future that the man who built this place could never quite have imagined. To understand Biltmore, you must first understand its scale. The human eye is not designed to comprehend 250 rooms. The number itself becomes meaningless, an abstraction that refuses to resolve into experience. So instead, consider this. A person walking through every room of Biltmore, spending merely 30 seconds in each, would spend more than 2 hours just moving through the space. They would travel over 4 miles of hallways and corridors. They would climb and descend enough stairs to equal scaling a 10-story building. And at the end, they would remember perhaps a dozen of those rooms clearly, the rest blurring into a kaleidoscope of marble and mahogany and light. The house contains 35 bedrooms for family and guests, 43 bathrooms, 65 fireplaces, a banquet hall 72 feet long and 42 feet wide, with a ceiling that soars to more than 70 feet overhead. A vertical space so dramatic that many medieval cathedrals would not surpass it. This single room could host the entire population of a small village for a feast. Its triple fireplaces could burn enough wood in a single evening to heat an ordinary home for a month. The library holds 23,000 volumes, making it one of the largest private book collections in America. The shelves reach so high that visitors must climb spiral staircases to access the upper levels. A painted ceiling depicts dawn breaking over clouds, designed so that readers below would always feel they were pursuing knowledge beneath an endless sky. There is an indoor swimming pool, heated by the same system that warms the house, lined with tiles imported from Europe. There's a bowling alley, its lanes made from polished wood now more than a century old. There's a gymnasium equipped with the fitness technology of the Gilded Age, weight machines and rowing apparatus and mirrored walls for self-inspection. There are breakfast rooms and sitting rooms and smoking rooms and bedrooms and dressing rooms and galleries and a winter garden where tropical plants bloom while snow drifts past the glass. And beneath all of this, invisible to the casual visitor, lies the true machinery of the estate. The sub-basement stretches across the entire footprint of the house, a parallel world of stone tunnels and mechanical spaces and storage rooms carved from the mountainside. Here, coal was shoveled into furnaces around the clock during winter months, tons of coal. Mountains of coal, delivered by a private railroad spur built specifically to supply this single household. The furnaces heated water that was pumped through miles of cast iron pipes to radiators positioned throughout the house. To keep the temperature comfortable in December, required burning enough fuel each day to power a small factory. Electricity came from a private generation plant on the estate grounds. Biltmore was one of the first homes in America to be entirely wired for electric light, a technology so new that many of the guests arriving for that Christmas celebration in 1895 had never seen it in a private residence. But electricity did not appear by wishing. It required engineers and dynamos and constant maintenance. It required coal and water and labor, endless labor, to produce something that wealthy visitors experienced as effortless illumination. The kitchens occupied their own wing, designed not for a family, but for an army. Walk-in refrigerators preserved meat and dairy through ice harvested from the estate's own ponds during winter. Pantries stored enough provisions to feed 100 guests for weeks without resupply. A rotisserie in the main kitchen could roast an entire side of beef. Dumbwaiters and speaking tubes connected the kitchen to the dining areas above, so that food might arrive hot despite traveling through corridors that stretched hundreds of feet. Laundry facilities included industrial-scale washing equipment and drying rooms maintained at constant temperature. Linens for 250 rooms, changed on schedules that varied by room and season, required a staff of dozens working daily shifts. Each guest bedroom contained sheets and blankets and towels of Egyptian cotton and French linen, materials that demanded hand washing, careful pressing, precise folding, and storage in closets kept free of moths and moisture. None of this was visible to the guests who drifted through the public spaces, who admired the artwork and gathered in the banquet hall and listened to musicians playing in the gallery. The design ensured this separation. Servants moved through hidden corridors. Deliveries arrived through basement entrances. The machinery of daily life was concealed so completely that Biltmore could maintain the illusion that comfort was effortless, that beauty was free, that elegance arose naturally rather than from the ceaseless efforts of hundreds of unseen hands. But the illusion was just that, an illusion, and the man who created it knew this better than anyone. George Washington Vanderbilt II was not the man his name suggested. The Vanderbilts were builders. His grandfather, Cornelius, known as the Commodore, had accumulated the largest fortune in American history through railroads and ruthless business practices. His father, William Henry, had doubled that fortune and become, at one point, the richest man in the world. His brothers threw their energies into yachts and horse racing and the construction of ostentatious mansions along Fifth Avenue in New York. They lived loudly, competitively, with the vulgar exuberance of the newly rich. George was different. Born in 1862, the youngest of 8 children, he grew up in the shadow of wealth so vast it ceased to have meaning. He never knew want. He never knew struggle. But he also never knew the hunger that had driven his grandfather to conquer, or the competitive fire that burned in his brothers. What he knew was books. By the time he was a young man, George Vanderbilt had read more than any Vanderbilt before him. He was fluent in 8 languages. He could discuss Dante in Italian, Goethe in German, the philosophers of France in their native tongue. He haunted museums and galleries. He collected art with genuine sophistication, not as trophies, but as objects of study and love. He was, by the standards of his family, peculiar, too quiet, too bookish, too removed from the world of commerce that had made the Vanderbilt name. His health was delicate, his manner was reserved. In a family of titans, he seemed almost fragile, a scholar born into a house of conquerors. And yet, something stirred in him that would produce the most ambitious building project any American private citizen had ever attempted. In 1888, when George was 26 years old, he visited the mountains of western North Carolina for the first time. The region was remote then, accessible only by difficult roads and a newly constructed railroad. The air was clean, the forests ancient, the mountains folded into blue distances that seemed to promise escape from everything the modern world had become. George fell in love, not with a person, that would come later, but with a landscape, with the quality of the light, with the silence of the valleys, with the notion that here, at the edge of the Appalachian wilderness, he might build something that had never existed before. Not a mansion, but a world, a self-contained estate where beauty and learning and the careful management of land might create a life unlike any he had known in the frantic circles in New York society. He began buying land. At first, hundreds of acres, then thousands, then tens of thousands. He bought farms from struggling families, timber rights from logging companies, entire ridgelines and watersheds. By the time he was finished, George Vanderbilt owned more than 125,000 acres of the North Carolina mountains, a private empire larger than many European principalities, stretching from valley floor to summit, encompassing entire ecosystems and communities and futures. And at the heart of this empire, he would build his house. Construction began in 1889. The site George selected was a natural plateau overlooking the French Broad River, with views extending to Mount Pisgah and the Blue Peaks beyond. It was remote, beautiful, and extraordinarily difficult to reach. Before a single foundation stone could be laid, an entire infrastructure had to be created from nothing. A 3-mile railroad spur was built connecting the site to the main Southern Railway line. This was not a luxury but a necessity. There was no other way to transport the millions of pounds of material that would be required. Along this spur, narrow-gauge tracks were laid to move stone and timber within the construction site itself. The mountain had to be reshaped before it could be built upon. The architect was Richard Morris Hunt, then the most celebrated designer in America. Hunt had trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the first American to do so, and his buildings defined the aspirations of the Gilded Age elite. He had designed mansions for Vanderbilts before, the Marble House and the Breakers in Newport, but those were summer cottages compared to what George now proposed. What George wanted was something that had never been seen on American soil, a chateau in the French Renaissance style with the grandeur of Chambord or Blois, but adapted to modern American engineering and American excess. A house that would contain not just rooms but systems, not just elegance but technology, not just art but philosophy. Hunt accepted the commission. He was aging, ill, perhaps aware that this would be his final masterpiece. He poured everything he had into the design, producing drawings of such detail that individual ironwork patterns and ceiling moldings were specified down to the inch. The landscape would be shaped by Frederick Law Olmsted, creator of Central Park in New York and the most influential landscape architect in American history. But Olmsted faced a challenge at Biltmore that was unique in his career. The land George had purchased was not park-ready. It was devastated, stripped by logging, eroded by bad farming practices, scarred by decades of exploitation. Creating the graceful lawns and gardens that would frame the chateau required not decoration, but restoration. Olmsted developed a plan that would consume the rest of his professional life. 3 miles of approach road, designed so that the first view of the house would be delayed until the final curve, maximizing the dramatic impact. A formal esplanade and ramp douce for the entrance facade. An Italian garden with reflecting pools, a walled English garden for flowers, an azalea garden following the natural contours of a stream, and surrounding all of this, thousands of acres of managed forest, replanted with scientifically selected species, the first major reforestation project in America. The construction workforce grew until, at its peak, more than 1,000 men labored on the site simultaneously. These were not romantic figures. They were workers, stonemasons and bricklayers and carpenters and plasterers and iron workers and common laborers who dug and hauled and lifted until their bodies broke. Many of them were immigrants brought to this remote mountainside from Italy and Ireland and Eastern Europe because they possessed skills that native-born American workers lacked. They lived in temporary camps, slept in rough quarters, ate meals prepared in field kitchens. They were paid wages that seemed fair by the standards of the era, but that represented, in human terms, the exchange of health and years for dollars and cents. The limestone came from Indiana, quarried in blocks that weighed thousands of pounds each, transported by rail across half a continent. Each block had to be cut and shaped and fitted by hand. The precision required was extraordinary. Mortar joints were kept deliberately thin to emphasize the seamless quality of the stonework, which meant that every surface had to be finished with tolerances measured in fractions of an inch. Bricks were manufactured on site, in kilns that burned day and night for years. The clay was dug from Biltmore's own land, mixed according to formulas that would produce consistent color and density, fired and cooled and stacked by teams of workers who repeated the same motions thousands of times per week. The ironwork, for gates and railings and structural supports, was forged on the estate and in distant foundries, shaped into patterns that Hunt had drawn with the flourishes of Renaissance design books. The glass came from Europe and from American factories. The tiles for floors and walls were imported from Spain and Italy and France. Craftsmen arrived from across the Atlantic to execute details that American workers could not replicate. Wood carvers from Austria who could translate Hunt's drawings into three-dimensional oak and walnut. Marble workers from Italy who knew how to cut and polish and set stone that had been quarried in the same countries their grandparents had worked. Painters who specialized in gilding and murals and the precise application of color to ceilings that would be viewed from 60 feet below. The house rose slowly. Season after season, year after year, the walls climbed and the towers took shape, and the roofline began to define itself against the mountain sky. George Vanderbilt visited regularly, watching his dream materialize, adjusting details, approving expenditures that would have bankrupted most American families several times over. Richard Morris Hunt did not live to see the completion. He died in the summer of 1895, just months before the house opened. Frederick Law Olmsted's mind failed him before the landscaping was finished. He spent his final years in an asylum, unable to recognize the gardens he had designed. The two men who had done most to create Biltmore were destroyed by it. Hunt by the strain of work, Olmsted by the cruelty of age, and the house they built together became their monument. In December of 1895, 6 years after construction began, George Vanderbilt declared Biltmore complete enough to host its first Christmas celebration. The guests arrived through the snow, as we have seen, and the cost, the true cost, not just in dollars but in lives and health and years, remained hidden beneath the foundations, filed away in ledgers, buried in graves across 2 continents. The money was always a question. George Vanderbilt's inheritance was substantial, but it was not infinite. His share of the family fortune amounted to something between $10 and $15 million, equivalent to several hundred million today. This sounds like wealth beyond measure, but Biltmore had the capacity to consume wealth the way fire consumes wood. Construction costs alone ran to approximately $6 million. The number seems almost quaint now, but in 1895, it represented nearly half of George's entire inheritance, expended on a single house before that house had generated a single day of usefulness. The estate lands, 125,000 acres purchased at prices that varied wildly based on seller desperation and negotiating skill, added millions more. And then the operating costs began. Staffing the house at full capacity required between 80 and 100 servants in the mansion alone, a butler and an under-butler, a housekeeper and assistant housekeepers, footmen and parlor maids and chambermaids and laundry maids and kitchen staff and scullery workers, a chef and sous chefs and pastry specialists, valets and ladies' maids for family and guests, groundskeepers and gardeners and stable hands and coachmen, engineers for the electrical system and the heating system and the plumbing, foresters for the vast woodland holdings, farmers for the dairy and the agricultural operations. Each of these people required wages, housing, food, and management. The payroll alone consumed tens of thousands of dollars annually, at a time when the average American worker earned perhaps $500 a year. The heating system devoured coal at a rate that would have supplied a small town. During winter months, when the family was typically in residence and the house was heated to comfortable temperatures, the boilers burned several tons of coal per day. Multiply this by the weeks and months of a Carolina winter. Calculate the cost of mining and transporting and storing that fuel, and the numbers become staggering. Electricity was similarly expensive in an era before the rural power grid. The estate's generators required fuel, maintenance, and skilled operators. Every lit chandelier, every illuminated hallway, every electrical convenience represented an ongoing expense that would never end as long as the house remained occupied. Food for a household of this scale could not be purchased from local markets. There were no local markets capable of supplying provisions at this quantity and quality. The estate attempted self-sufficiency where possible, raising dairy cattle and poultry, maintaining extensive vegetable gardens, cultivating orchards. But specialized items, fine wines, imported delicacies, exotic ingredients for the elaborate meals that Gilded Age hospitality required, had to be shipped from distant cities at considerable cost. George understood from the beginning that Biltmore could not survive as a mere pleasure palace. Unlike his brothers, who treated their Newport cottages as seasonal amusements, George envisioned his estate as a working enterprise. The vast forest holdings would be managed scientifically, producing timber revenues that might offset operating costs. The dairy would sell products to regional markets. The gardens would supply produce for sale as well as consumption. Every element of the estate was intended to contribute in some way to financial sustainability. He hired Gifford Pinchot, a young forester trained in European methods, to develop America's first systematic forest management plan. Pinchot would later become the first chief of the United States Forest Service, and the work he did at Biltmore established principles that would shape conservation policy for generations. He was succeeded by Carl Schenck, a German forester who founded the Biltmore Forest School in 1898, the first school of forestry in America, training young men in sustainable woodland management on the slopes of the Blue Ridge. The dairy became a model operation, with prize-winning Jersey cattle and facilities that represented the best thinking of agricultural science. Milk and butter bearing the Biltmore label found their way into homes across the region. The estate experimented with crop rotation, soil improvement, and livestock breeding techniques that were studied and copied by farmers throughout the South. But none of it was enough. The revenues generated by timber and dairy and agriculture could not match the relentless outflow of operating expenses. The house was simply too large, too complex, too demanding. It consumed everything that George threw at it and asked for more. By the early 1900s, the financial strain was beginning to show. George curtailed certain expenses. He reduced staff. He limited entertaining. The great Christmas celebrations that had marked the estate's opening became less frequent, smaller, more modest in their ambitions. And then, in 1914, catastrophe struck. George Washington Vanderbilt died on March 6, 1914, in Washington, D.C. He was 51 years old, far too young for a man of his wealth and position. The cause was complications from an emergency appendectomy, a surgery that should have been routine, but that went wrong in ways the medicine of that era could not prevent. He left behind a wife, Edith, and a daughter, Cornelia, and an estate whose annual operating costs exceeded its annual revenues by a margin that would have destroyed any ordinary fortune. Edith Vanderbilt was not an ordinary woman. She had married George in 1898 after a courtship that scandalized some elements of society. She was of less distinguished birth than the Vanderbilt name seemed to require, and she was possessed of an independence of spirit that made many old money families uncomfortable. But she loved George genuinely, and she understood Biltmore in ways that many observers missed. When George died, Edith did not collapse. She assessed, she calculated. She made the brutal decisions that survival required. Within 3 years, she'd sold 86,700 acres of the estate's forest lands to the United States government for approximately $5 per acre. This was less than George had paid for much of the property, a loss by any financial measure. But it accomplished two things. It provided the capital needed to continue operating the house, and it ensured that the lands would be preserved forever as the Pisgah National Forest, rather than stripped and developed. The sale was not a betrayal of George's vision. It was an adaptation of that vision to circumstances he could not have foreseen. The forests he had replanted and restored would remain protected, just under public rather than private ownership. The conservation work that Pinchot and Schenck had pioneered would continue under government stewardship. But the estate that remained, now reduced to approximately 10,000 acres, still required income that its operations could not provide. Edith remarried to a senator named Peter Gerry and moved to Rhode Island. Cornelia, now the principal heir, came of age and married a British diplomat named John Francis Amherst Cecil. The young couple took up residence at Biltmore, and a new generation faced the same question that had haunted the estate from its beginning. How do you pay for a house that was never designed to pay for itself? The answer came from an unlikely source: the Great Depression. By 1930, the American economy had collapsed. Banks failed, factories closed, unemployment reached levels that the nation had never experienced. In cities across the country, bread lines stretched around blocks, and families who had once lived comfortably found themselves without food, shelter, or hope. Asheville, the small city nearest to Biltmore, was devastated. Its economy had depended on tourism and banking, and both had evaporated. The city government approached the Cecil family with a desperate proposal. Would they consider opening Biltmore to the public? The logic was this: Asheville needed tourist attractions to draw visitors, and visitors meant economic activity, hotels and restaurants and shops that might employ local workers and generate tax revenue. Biltmore, if opened for tours, would become the most spectacular attraction in the region. John Cecil, who had assumed management of the estate, faced a choice that his father-in-law would never have imagined. George Vanderbilt had built Biltmore as a private retreat, a sanctuary from the world, a place where beauty and learning could be cultivated away from the vulgar gaze of the masses. Opening the house to paying visitors would transform it from a home into a business, from a refuge into a spectacle. It would mean strangers walking through private rooms, touching private objects, observing private spaces that had been designed for family and intimate guests. But the alternative was worse. Without new revenue sources, Biltmore would consume its remaining capital within years. The staff would have to be dismissed entirely. The house would fall into decay. The gardens would run wild. The great rooms would gather dust and mold and the slow deterioration that claims every abandoned structure. In March of 1930, Biltmore opened its doors to the public. Admission was $2 per person, a significant sum during the Depression, equivalent to $20 or $30 today. And yet, they came. Thousands of them, Americans who had never seen anything like Biltmore, who would never be invited to a private estate of this scale, who lined up and paid their money and walked through the great halls with eyes wide and voices hushed. The experiment worked. Not lavishly. Depression-era tourism could not generate lavish profits, but sufficiently. The admission revenue, combined with reduced operating costs and disciplined management, allowed the house to survive. The staff remained, albeit in smaller numbers. The maintenance continued, the gardens were preserved, and something unexpected happened. The visitors who came to Biltmore did not diminish it with their presence, they validated it. They confirmed that this house, which might have seemed like an absurd monument to Gilded Age excess, possessed genuine beauty, genuine significance, genuine power to move and inspire. The public did not mock Biltmore. They loved it. The decision that had seemed like a surrender became, in retrospect, a stroke of genius. Biltmore had found its future not by resisting change but by embracing it. The decades that followed brought new challenges, each requiring new adaptations. The Second World War disrupted tourism and created shortages of materials and labor. The Cecil family agreed to house art treasures from the National Gallery of Art, which was concerned that enemy action might threaten collections stored in Washington. For a period during the war, priceless paintings by Rembrandt and Vermeer and Raphael hung in the rooms of Biltmore, protected by the remote Carolina mountains from the bombs that were falling on cities across Europe. The post-war period brought increasing visitor numbers, but also increasing expectations. Modern tourists wanted amenities that the Gilded Age had never anticipated: comfortable restrooms, accessible pathways, places to eat and shop and rest. The estate had to modernize while preserving its historic character, a balance that proved endlessly difficult. Air conditioning, unknown when the house was built, became essential for comfortable summer visits. The electrical system required constant upgrading to meet modern safety standards. The heating system, designed for coal, had to be converted to cleaner fuels. The plumbing, a marvel in 1895, became problematic as the technology aged and replacement parts ceased to exist. Each renovation cost money. Each improvement required specialists who understood both historical preservation and modern engineering. The decisions accumulated: which rooms to restore to their original appearance, which to modify for public access, which systems to replace, and which to preserve as artifacts. And through it all, the fundamental economics remain challenging. A house of this scale generates expenses that never sleep. The roof alone covers more than an acre. It requires constant inspection, repair, and periodic replacement. The limestone facade, exposed to Carolina weather for more than a century, develops cracks and erosion that must be addressed before they become structural failures. The ironwork rusts, the windows leak, the woodwork shrinks and swells with seasonal humidity changes. The gardens require armies of workers, not literally armies, but dozens of trained horticulturists who understand not just how to plant and prune, but how to maintain the specific historical character that Olmsted intended. The formal gardens demand different skills than the woodland gardens, which demand different skills than the agricultural lands, which demand different skills than the forest management operations that continue across the reduced estate acreage. By the late 20th century, Biltmore employed more than 1,000 people year-round, with additional seasonal workers during peak tourism months. This made it one of the largest employers in the Asheville region, a reversal of the historic relationship in which the estate depended on the region's labor pool for survival. The Cecil family had become, without ever intending to, hospitality entrepreneurs. They opened an inn on the estate grounds, then a winery, then additional restaurants and shops. They created event spaces for weddings and corporate retreats. They developed seasonal programming. Christmas at Biltmore became a destination attraction, with thousands of trees decorated and millions of lights illuminating the house and gardens. Critics sometimes wondered if all of this commercialization betrayed George Vanderbilt's original vision. Wasn't Biltmore supposed to be a retreat from modern vulgarity? Didn't the gift shops and wine tastings and wedding packages represent exactly the kind of crass commerce that George had sought to escape? But the criticism missed a fundamental point. George's vision had contained an internal contradiction from the beginning. He wanted to create a permanent sanctuary of beauty and learning, but he built that sanctuary on a scale that no private fortune could sustain indefinitely. The choice was never between pure preservation and commercial adaptation. The choice was between commercial adaptation and oblivion. The Cecil family chose adaptation. They chose survival. And through that survival, they preserved more of George's original vision than any purist approach could have achieved. The house still stands. The gardens still bloom. The art still hangs on the walls. The books still fill the library shelves. Millions of people have experienced beauty that would otherwise have crumbled into ruin. Today, Biltmore operates as a carefully calibrated machine. More than 1.5 million visitors pass through the estate each year. They arrive in buses and rental cars, streaming up the approach road that Olmsted designed to maximize dramatic revelation. They park in lots that hold thousands of vehicles. They purchase tickets that cost at peak times more than $80 for adults, a price that reflects not the market value of entertainment, but the actual cost of preservation. The estate employs approximately 2,400 people. This includes tour guides and groundskeepers and maintenance workers and hospitality staff and security personnel and historians and conservators and administrators. It includes the team that manages the winery, which now produces more than 100,000 cases of wine annually. It includes the staff of the inn and the restaurants and the shops. It includes the technicians who maintain climate control systems, and the archivists who preserve documents, and the craftspeople who repair century-old fixtures. The work is endless. Consider a single aspect: fabric conservation. Biltmore contains thousands of pieces of historic textiles, curtains and upholstery and tapestries and carpets and linens that date to the original furnishing of the house. Ultraviolet light degrades fiber, dust degrades surfaces, humidity promotes mold growth. Even without any human touch, these materials would slowly disintegrate over time. To slow this process, conservators have developed elaborate protocols. Curtains are rotated to prevent uneven sun exposure. Carpets are covered with protective materials when rooms are not in use. Climate control systems maintain temperature and humidity within narrow ranges. Lighting is calibrated to minimize UV radiation while still allowing visitors to see. The most fragile textiles require periodic restoration, work performed by specialists who spend months analyzing thread patterns and dye compositions, who repair damage using techniques that would be recognizable to medieval craftspeople, who document every intervention so that future conservators will understand what has been changed and why. This is just textiles. Similar programs exist for paintings, for furniture, for silver, for architectural elements, for outdoor sculptures, for living plant collections, for mechanical systems, for everything within the estate's boundaries. The cost of all this preservation runs to tens of millions of dollars annually. Some of it is offset by admission revenues and hospitality operations. Some is funded by a nonprofit foundation that solicits donations and grants. Some is covered by careful financial management that reinvests profits rather than distributing them. But there is never a surplus. There's never a point at which the estate's managers can declare victory and relax their vigilance. Every year brings new challenges: weather damage, unexpected failures, rising labor costs, shifts in tourism patterns. Every year requires new strategies, new investments, new adaptations. The present is not a destination, but a perpetual journey. And yet, walking through Biltmore today, you might never sense this struggle. The house presents itself as it always has, magnificent, serene, confident in its grandeur. The guided tours move visitors through the public rooms with choreographed efficiency, each transition timed to maximize the sense of discovery. Here is the banquet hall, vast and towering. Here is the library, warm with the smell of old paper. Here is the tapestry gallery, displaying textiles that have survived 5 centuries of European history. The docents speak of George Vanderbilt's vision, his love of art, his sophisticated tastes. They speak of the famous guests who once occupied these rooms, the parties and gatherings that defined Gilded Age society. They speak of Edith's grace and Cornelia's charm and the continuity of family stewardship across more than a century. What they rarely speak of, because it would break the spell, because it would intrude upon the experience that visitors have paid to receive, is the machinery that makes this beauty possible. Somewhere beneath the floors, technicians are monitoring climate control systems, adjusting temperatures to protect fragile collections. Somewhere in the kitchens, workers are preparing thousands of meals for visitors who will expect the quality and service that Biltmore's reputation demands. Somewhere in the gardens, crews are trimming and planting and weeding, performing the daily labor that keeps disorder at bay. The contrast between what visitors see and what workers do has not changed since 1895. The mechanisms are different. Electricity from the grid rather than private generators, computer systems instead of speaking tubes, modern materials instead of Victorian. But the fundamental structure remains. Beauty in the foreground, labor in the background, visible splendor sustained by invisible effort. This is not unique to Biltmore. Every great house, every palace, every cathedral, every monument that has survived from the past embodies the same duality. The Versailles that tourists photograph is the product of centuries of maintenance by thousands of workers whose names are recorded nowhere. The Sistine Chapel ceiling required not just Michelangelo's genius, but the scaffolding builders and pigment grinders and lime burners who made that genius visible. The Great Wall of China is maintained by crews who repair stone and replace mortar and clear vegetation every single day. We inherit beauty and imagine it has always been this way, that it simply exists, natural and permanent, requiring nothing from us but appreciation. But beauty is not natural. Beauty is not permanent. Beauty is the result of choices made by people, sustained by labor, purchased with resources that must come from somewhere. The pyramids of Giza did not build themselves. They required the organized labor of tens of thousands over decades, labor that was compelled rather than freely given, labor that cost lives and families and futures. We admire the pyramids while rarely asking what those workers sacrificed so that a dead king might have his monument. Biltmore invites the same forgetfulness. The house is so beautiful, so complete, so perfectly presented that it seems to exist outside of time and economics and human cost. It seems to simply be. But behind every beautiful room stands someone who cleaned it. Behind every blooming garden stands someone who planted and watered and weeded. Behind every glowing light stands someone who paid for the power. Behind every hour of preservation stands money that was earned somewhere, by someone, through labor that the visitors enjoying the results will never see. George Washington Vanderbilt understood this. He spent his life trying to create a self-sustaining enterprise, a place where beauty could pay for itself through productive use of the land. His forests and farms were not hobbies, but economic necessities, attempts to generate the revenue that operating his dream required. He failed, ultimately. The economics never balanced. The house consumed more than it produced, and after his death, his widow had to sell 2/3 of the land to generate the capital needed to continue. But his attempt was genuine. He recognized that beauty without sustainability is fantasy, a pleasant illusion that will dissolve when the money runs out. He tried to build something that could last, and if his methods were imperfect, his intention was sound. The question his descendants have faced is how to honor that intention in a world he could not have imagined. They chose commerce. They opened the doors to strangers. They sold wine and lodging and experiences. They transformed a private sanctuary into a public attraction. Some might call this a betrayal. But what was the alternative? A beautiful corpse, decaying behind locked gates. A monument of vanity crumbling into the mountain, a dream that died because no one was willing to do what survival required. The Cecil family chose differently. They chose to adapt. They chose to serve. And in that service, to visitors who pay admission, to workers who maintain the estate, to history that demands preservation, they found a way forward that George himself might not have anticipated, but would perhaps have understood. The deeper question Biltmore poses is not about money. It is about what we truly value and what we are willing to sacrifice to preserve what we value. George Vanderbilt valued beauty. He valued learning. He valued the careful cultivation of land and art and human knowledge. He spent his fortune, an enormous fortune, accumulated through the labor of thousands who built railroads and stoked furnaces and laid track across a continent to create a place where those values could be embodied. But values, once embodied, must be maintained. The paintings fade, the books crumble, the gardens overgrow, the stonework erodes, everything material, left to itself, deteriorates toward disorder. Preservation is not a single act, but a continuous commitment, a choice renewed every day, every year, across generations. Who makes that choice at Biltmore? In one sense, the Cecil family and their employees make it. They show up each morning. They perform the work. They make the decisions about what to restore and what to defer, which rooms to prioritize and which to neglect, how to balance historical authenticity against visitor safety, against financial constraint. But in another sense, the visitors make that choice. Every admission ticket is a vote. Every dollar spent in the gift shop or the winery or the inn is a statement that this place matters, that it deserves to continue, that its preservation is worth something to those who experience it. And in yet another sense, all of us make that choice. Biltmore exists within a society that decides, through its policies and priorities, what is worth saving and what can be allowed to disappear. Tax laws affect the economics of preservation. Environmental regulations shape what can be built and how. Cultural values determine whether historical estates are seen as treasures to be protected or relics to be demolished. The survival of Biltmore is not automatic. It was not guaranteed in 1895 when the house opened. It was not guaranteed in 1914 when George died. It was not guaranteed in 1930 when the Depression threatened to destroy everything. It is not guaranteed today, despite the apparent success and the millions of visitors and the thriving operations. One generation's commitment does not bind the next. Every choice to preserve is also a choice not to use those resources for something else. Every dollar spent on mansion maintenance is a dollar not spent on schools or hospitals or housing. Every hour of labor devoted to antique conservation is an hour not devoted to building something new. These are not arguments against preservation. They are recognitions that preservation has costs, and those costs must be weighed against benefits, and reasonable people might weigh them differently. What Biltmore teaches is that great beauty does not sustain itself. It is sustained by people who choose, day after day, to do the work. It is sustained by money that flows from somewhere, from visitors, from donors, from enterprises that generate revenue. It is sustained by decisions that balance competing values, that accept compromise as the price of continuation. Late afternoon at Biltmore. The last tours of the day are finishing. Visitors stream toward the exits, some lingering in the gardens for final photographs, others heading to the winery or the shops for concluding purchases. The light turns golden on the limestone facade, then amber, then the soft rose of mountain sunset. Inside the house, staff members are beginning the end-of-day protocols. Rooms are secured, lights are dimmed. The climate control systems adjust for nighttime operation. In the basement, technicians check readings and make notes. In the grounds department offices, tomorrow's work schedules are reviewed and finalized. The house settles into the peculiar silence that comes when the visitors have gone. For a few hours, Biltmore will be what it was built to be. A private sanctuary, quiet and beautiful, filled with treasures that no one is looking at. But only for a few hours. Tomorrow the cycle begins again. The gates will open, the visitors will arrive, the machinery of hospitality will swing into motion, and the endless work of preservation will continue, invisible, essential, never quite finished. George Vanderbilt's dream was real. He made it stone and glass and wood. He planted it in gardens and filled it with art and wrote it into the landscape of the Carolina mountains. But the dream was never complete. It could never be complete. A dream like this is not a destination, but a process, a thing that must be renewed and sustained and paid for every single day. The true cost of Biltmore is not the $6 million George spent on construction or the millions more that have flowed through its operations across a century and a quarter. The true cost is the commitment, the daily choice to continue, the endless labor of maintenance and restoration and adaptation. And the answer to who pays that cost is complex and changing. George paid with his fortune and his health and his life. Edith paid with land sales and difficult decisions. The Cecil family has paid with generations of stewardship. The workers pay with their labor. The visitors pay with their money. And all of us pay in some small way by living in a society that values what Biltmore represents, and by the taxes and policies and cultural choices that make preservation possible or impossible. Great beauty does not survive on admiration alone. It endures only through continuous effort, compromise, and service. And what survives is never quite the same as what was built. It is transformed by the very efforts that preserve it, shaped by the needs of each generation, adapted to circumstances that its creators could not have foreseen. Biltmore in 1995 was not what George imagined in 1889. Biltmore today is not what existed in 1930. And Biltmore a century from now, if it survives, if someone is still willing to pay the cost, will be different yet again. The house remains, but everything around it changes. And in that tension, between permanence and change, between beauty and cost, between the dream and the machinery that keeps it alive, lies the deepest truth that Biltmore has to teach. Nothing magnificent is free, nothing beautiful is permanent without effort, and the price of great dreams is not paid once, but forever.